John, you say on your website that the ways we communicate with each other and the world around us have always been major points of interest and contention throughout my life. I'm interested in the interest versus contention. So can you talk a little bit about interest and contention and how it's played out in your work at Standing Rock specifically?
That's a big question.
I know.
It's kind of a lifelong question that I'm still trying to answer. I mean, with all honesty, I think as a photographer or somebody who goes out in the world who makes work that is about anything other than my own life, that's probably the seed of it, is the fact that, you know, I am a white guy, comes from suburbia, comes from, I've been educated, comes from middle class, a lot of reasons why I would consider myself and be accepting of being called privileged, right? And going out into the world and trying to understand and pay attention and work with others of different backgrounds is something that history is fraught with examples of why it can be really problematic. People coming to save the world, or people coming to take over the world, power trip and take advantage of others and others' cultures, moving in, not understanding why people do things the way they do things, what their choices are, and even people who are really with good intentions, quote unquote do-gooders in the world, trying to go out there and help others, but do it in a way that creates more negativity than positive energy, is something that I'm very conscious of. But I grew up as I said, all those things as somebody with opportunity in suburbia in Connecticut, of a Jewish family that was agnostic, not religious, but had always been Jewish, and way back. And they were people who were persecuted in Europe and came over to the U.S., immigrated here as trying to get away from things that were happening to them in Europe and Russia. And once my relatives, all my grandparents' generation, came over, they would never talk about our culture and traditions in the past. So their belief was that the best way to help their family to move forward was to literally move forward. And if we ever, as kids, would talk about who we were, our background, and where our family came from, traditions, culture, any of that, all they would say is, "You're American now, that's all you need to know. You're here, just, you're American." And they'd give us the talk about the melting pot and that we're all the same. So I grew up going to school and learning about that and believing in that, and all the way through high school and everything, and never really had much experience traveling or connecting with people of really different cultures in a way where we acknowledge cultural difference until I was even through college pretty much, and in graduate school. And then after graduate school, like 28 years ago, was invited to go out to the Pine Ridge Reservation and meet an elder that a friend was going to visit, and she thought I would like, who would like me. And I went out there for the first time and stayed in his property with him for a month, and was just sort of blown away by the experience of getting to know people who were so extremely different, but really worked hard to hold on to their culture and their traditions and their heritage. And it was all things, there was a lot of things I read about. When I was in college, I read about a lot of different philosophies and religions and cultures and communities, but I had never experienced them. But just having been there for that month and experienced all the ways that these people live differently was really, a great opportunity and really fun and really intriguing and everything. But when I came home, I had incredible culture shock. So I take students traveling now. Over the last dozen years or so, I take students traveling a lot, actually for the last 24 years. And people always talk about culture shock and getting people to know about culture shock, and I'm always trying to point out that I think the biggest culture shock is when you go back home. Because when you go back home, you realize about the ways that we live and we take for granted. And I had never really thought about privilege as much as I did. I never thought about how much I was longing for more tradition and culture and background. So anyway, that first time to Pine Ridge Reservation was a huge eye-opener. And what I learned over the time was that there's a lot of really wonderful things that people have in different cultures that we are longing for and we have let go of that we should be reminded of. But when I look at the ways that documentarians and anthropologists and educators and politicians and bureaucrats and all the different categories we can list off have gone into communities and worked with those communities, there really is easily more negative things to talk about than positive things. And now in the world, when we've gone from, years ago we went into postmodernism, and when we went into postmodernism, people really started trying to pay attention to how everything you do is affected by everything else that was done before you, and everything you do will affect everything after you in a way that is less selfish and I think is more acknowledging influence and important differences. And one of the ways that artists, photographers, and anthropologists, educators have been dealing with it is to do more work where we just look at ourselves. And there's a lot of really good reasons for that. And I really question all the time on a regular basis, who am I to go into these other places and make images or think that I can tell somebody else's story or anything like that. There's a lot of obvious problems with it now. But there's also this voice in my head that's always thinking about one part of why I got interested in photography was because I liked going out in the world and connecting with people. When I was doing photography in the beginning, I was also making jewelry, and I really loved making jewelry too. And I got to a point where I felt like I couldn't do both really well. I didn't have enough time, didn't have enough energy in life to do both, and that I was going to do better if I just chose one or the other. And I chose photography because photography caused me to engage with the world around me, where making jewelry was really creative and the skill challenge was just as huge, and I probably could have made money just as well, I don't know. But I would be much more likely to be in my own studio by myself most of the time. And I wanted to go out in the world and relate to people. I wanted to learn from people and share with people and grow with people. And so the photography became the thing, and there's a lot of great photographers who, maybe even more these days, if we go to New York City, we might find that there's more people who are making work in the galleries and museums and so forth, where they're making work in their studio with friends or by themselves, where they're setting things up and designing things, directing things, and making work that's about world issues, but they're doing it looking inward while they talk about things that are looking outward. I'm not a very good director. I think that every time I try it, I feel like the work doesn't come off to me as being sincere or believable, and it feels awkward. The work that to me is the most fun to do, challenging to do, or as challenging, but where I feel like sometimes is more successful is when I go out and relate to the world that's out there. So I like going out, and that way of being an explorer, goes out and not just observes things, but engages with people and communities and observes and tries to make a statement. And one of the ways that I tried to acknowledge that difference of that I'm not just telling my own story is by teaching people and giving people opportunities to tell their stories. So done a lot of teaching of photography in everything from kindergarten age up through nursing homes. My job is I teach at a college, Marlboro College, and I've been teaching there for 29 years. But on the side, I have co-founded a nonprofit 28 years ago where we teach kids regardless of ability to pay. We do cross-cultural programs. I've done visiting artist programs, set up programs on reservations with grants from Open Society Institute and others where we've been able to bring cameras, give cameras out, and connect artists and educators with people in communities and collaborate. And one of the programs that nonprofit does is we bring kids from all around the country in really diverse backgrounds together, and they live together for 3 weeks. It's called Exposures, and they live together for 3 weeks and use photography, sometimes video, sometimes mask making and other things, but mostly photography and writing to tell stories about who they are, where they come from. And the idea is to get people to open up to the reality that whatever we think is normal is a cultural expectation or cultural, it was developed and we were brought up to believe in it culturally, and that this is normal, and that it's a cultural construction, is what I'm trying to say. And that the more they realize that other people have a different vision of what is normal and start to try and understand it, the easier it is to not only tolerate but truly appreciate diversity, to get along, to build bridges, to make peace, and to also reflect back on our lives in a way that helps us see things that we're doing that we just take for granted and do without thinking that maybe we could learn to do in a better way. This is a really long-winded answer.
That's great. That's exactly why I asked the question.
Thank you. There is, it's this lifelong thing of the reality that I am who I am. I've got my background is what it is. I am not in your shoes. I'm not in somebody else's shoes. I can't tell their experience from their perception. But I hope that there's still a validity and an importance to me being able to tell a story that offers them an opportunity to tell their own story, but also acknowledges how I see other people's perspectives from where I am and how I think and they think we might be able to work together to find a better way to live in the world that's more just and more fair, and more respectful and appreciative. And I feel like in these political times, that's as important as it's ever been in my life.
Yes.
Where there's so much of this attitude of that, we should do what's right for ourselves, our family, our community, our people, our nation, our class, our religion, whatever, all these things that just tears me apart, because it also gets used in a way that sort of says it's okay for us to be greedy and walk all over people, when that's if I think about my mother's lessons to me and growing up, the lessons that I think was most dear to her, that is most important to me in my memory, is to try and be fair in the world and live in a way where we're trying to be more fair and more equitable. And if I could, live towards a way of honoring my mother's wishes in that, then I'll feel good. So, yeah, I go out in the world, and you asked about Standing Rock, and in Standing Rock I went to visit some indigenous friends who I knew were there, and I was so moved by the alternative quality of the community that I stayed there. And I had to keep coming home because I had a sick relative that I was taking care of. But from September to December, I was there for, I think, 8 weeks, and kept going back and forth on like 6 different trips. And while I was there, I worked with the camp media to try and, the camp had its own media, the movement did, to try and tell the story from their perspective. And I tried to be witness and tried to do what I could to help, and to be part of the camp media and all of that. I now have a book coming out about it. But all of these things are done with the frame of mind of knowing that I'm a middle-aged white boy from suburbia in Connecticut, and I am not indigenous, and that was an indigenous-led movement. It was important that it was seen as indigenous-led, and it's really important that the indigenous voices are heard. So, when I had an opportunity to make a book, just like being there, it was, once again, this question comes up of like, who am I to do this? And I hope I know of a few different books already. I know of a handful of films. I know of people who are going around teaching about the experience, and I hope that there's hundreds more that will be out there, because I think there were so many important things that were going on from people of all walks of life, but most importantly from the indigenous community. And it's not so much that it's not at all that I believe it's my place to tell the story more than theirs. It's theirs more than mine, but I still hope there's a seat at the table and a reason that people who are not indigenous, who had perceptions of the value of it, can talk to our own communities and with their communities about our perceptions.
Can you talk a bit now about the revised book that you formerly published and your new book?
Well, so when I first went to that reservation, Pine Ridge in South Dakota, and I think it was about 1992. I think it was 92. It may have been 91. But anyway, when I first went there and visited this man, Eugene Redis comes out first, and I had a great experience. But being a photographer, I always travel with cameras. I had cameras with me. But I really did feel at first that I had no right to be photographing his life, his family, and his people. So every day I would just, at a certain point of the day, I would tell him I was going to go off and go photograph. And I'd go photograph landscapes in the Badlands and in the plains. And then the very last day of being there, after a month, I asked him if he would be game to sit for a portrait. And with an 8x10" view camera, I made a portrait of him and his adopted niece, Victoria. And then when I got home, I made some various prints for him and sent them to him. And when I came back, he invited me back. And when I came back the next summer, he started doing things like every day he would tell his son who was my age. I was camping out on the land, and he's in his house. And in the morning, he would tell his son to go over in the morning and ask me. He'd say, "Go ask John if he'd bring his camera today and photograph this or that." You know, he wanted me to photograph somebody's birthday. He wanted me to photograph somebody's grave or memorial or certain things that were important to him. And you know, over time, it got to be a point where he asked me to photograph everything that was going on within his family and his Tioshpaye, which is like an extended family community. He asked me to photograph everything except for ceremony, because ceremony, it's very taboo to photograph, and for good reasons. But so gradually I was getting to a point where I just had my camera, but I still didn't use the photographs beyond there. I never felt like it was my place to. There was this real awareness. I felt like with both of us and the other people in the pictures, his family and or mutual friends, non-native people who were there as well, that it really didn't make sense for me to tell that story. But he passed away about 12 years ago, and in our last conversation, he asked me, what was I going to do with those photographs I've been making over the years? And I was really surprised that he asked. But I said said to Eugene that it wasn't my community. I was an outsider, and I never felt like it was my place to tell their story or to do anything with them. So I was making a commitment to him that I would not sell them or publish them or exhibit them. They would be photographs that would be for his family, my family, and our mutual friends. And that I did other work that I would exhibit and publish when I was home. And you know, he's a elderly man in his 80s and quiet, very quiet. And after a minute or two, he kind of, and he said, "Those pictures you made," he said, all he said was, "I would like you to use them to help my family and help my people." And I was really taken aback. Never thought he would have said that. And just let it sit. But when I got home from being out west, the Vermont College of Fine Arts, which I have worked with over the years, they had started a literary magazine, and they offered to publish 4 of those pictures and 4 from another project back east. And they were going to they were offering $500 to put them in this journal. And I never would have said yes before. I would have just tried to talk them into letting me do the 8 pictures, all from Massachusetts, this other project, which was not people anyway. But I kept hearing his voice, so I agreed, and I took the $500 and I bought his family a professional chainsaw, because they heat their houses with wood, at least they did at the time, and they would use a chainsaw that was about 35 years old. And it felt really good, and that chainsaw still works. And that was about 10, 12 years ago. And it's stashed underneath Grandma's bed, and she loans it out to people in the family when they need it. And every time they bring it back, she checks to make sure everything's there. So like I said, it felt good. And from that point on, I started, when I would have opportunities to exhibit the work, I would. When I would sell the work, I would give some of the money to the families or the tribal radio station or the college and things like that. And it started to feel like it had a purpose that could be useful. And so the publisher I had worked with before on another book offered to do a book about the work out there, because he was really interested in indigenous things. He had lived in the Southwest a lot. I had shared the pictures with him, just looking at them, because we both had these friends in indigenous communities, and he was my publisher, and shared them just for him to see, but not to publish. And at this point, he asked, he just actually didn't ask, he told me that he thought I had enough pictures to do a small book about Pine Ridge, and he would publish it if I wanted to do it. And I thought about it and said that, after what Eugene had said, that I would do it, but had decided that I would only do it if he would give me time to try and put indigenous voices in it. So I said I'd do it if he gave me a year to 2 years to collect ways to include voices, and spent all the trips over the next few years, which was quite a few trips, trying to get people to write, make their own photographs, and give me historical documents, information, review everything I was doing, and tell me whether or not they liked it. And everybody from people that I knew well to educators, librarians, tribal political leaders, and medicine men, indigenous spiritual people. And we got it down to a point where it seemed like it was in a good place, and published the book. And with photo books, they're expensive, so I think it had 2,000 copies. And I got a few hundred to give out to families and libraries there and stuff. And then the money from the sales, it was put in the contract that all the money would go to the tribal radio station, Keeley Radio, the voice of the Lakota Nation. And, you know, it wasn't a lot of money, but it was a few thousand at least. And that book was sold out, and it came out in 2010, and it sold out a few years back. And the publisher was game to redo it, but didn't want to just reprint it. Said that, you know, for him to redo it, he thought we should revise it. And there was a couple pictures in it wanted to take out, because even though I had shown it to a lot of people and had permission for using these particular photos, there was at least one that some people were upset that it was included. And then there was newer photographs and stories that wanted to include. There were ones about the housing issues on the reservation, and about how the U.S. government had taken Katrina trailer homes that were too poisonous for people in New Orleans, and said they cleaned them up, but then gave them to tribes for families could pay for the cost of transportation and they could have them, which I always thought was something that was kind of a worry and wasn't sure I trusted. And also because trailer homes don't hold up in the weather in the plains when there's no protection from trees and so forth. They get blown apart sometimes, and they're very hard to heat and very expensive to heat. That was one thing. And then another thing was there was a family who their son was the first soldier to be killed in, the first indigenous soldier to be killed in the Iraq War. And I was at his funeral and had made pictures, so put some of that in and a little story about that. So I made an update, and that's just come out, called Views from the Reservation Revised. Mm-hmm. And the money from that will go again to the tribal radio station, or I should say my portion of the royalties from that. And then also, after Standing Rock, the same publisher agreed to do a book about the honoring the water protectors. The indigenous people who started the movement against the Dakota Access Pipeline they were Standing Rock Reservation Sioux Lakota people who had wanted to protect their environment. When the pipeline was first planned, it was going to go up through just underneath Bismarck, North Dakota, and they decided that the local people didn't want it there because they were worried about it polluting the environment around where they live. So they rerouted it down about 65 miles south, and it was going right across 1 mile north of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. And that was then going to be the reason why it had to go under the Missouri River. And the Missouri River and Lake Aho, which is from the Missouri River, is where the Standing Rock Sioux get their water supply. And so they were very worried about this. And then so was the Cheyenne River Reservation, the Pine Ridge Reservation, Rosebud Sioux Reservation, and at least one more. And then there was, if it ever does leak, it will pollute the water that millions of Americans, not just indigenous people, but millions of Americans in the center of the country use for their water supply. So people had a lot of fear about it. But this community was a community that was set up to challenge it and try and stop it, but it was intentionally done through indigenous philosophy and indigenous ways, where instead of being protesting it and fighting it and militant style, what they chose to do was it was going to be a prayer community. And they put out a call from the tribal radio station there. They put out a call to people, indigenous people all over the world. And there was over 300 tribes from the United States that sent representation. And then indigenous people from other countries came too, but also people from all over the world. I met people there from Asia, from Australia, from Latin America, from North America, from Europe, from all over. It was amazing. And every week there was more people would come, other people would leave to go home to work or their families or whatever, but the biggest the camp was around Thanksgiving. I think they said there was over 15,000 people there at one time. And at one point, thousands of veterans came to stand between the indigenous movement and the police because they didn't like the way the police were stopping the protest movement. But it really wasn't, they never wanted to be called protesters. They were trying to argue against and protest against the idea of putting the pipeline in and not taking care of the environment, but they call themselves water protectors. And so this book is one where it documents through my photographs as much as I could, because that's what the publisher was saying he wanted to do, was publish a book of my photographs. But we put out a call for other submissions. There's poetry by different people. We interviewed, made special trip to interview on 3 different reservations. There's some letters and submissions that people just sent. There's some kids things there was a school on the camp. There's some ephemera that just acknowledges the way that indigenous people had been presented in this country as long as we've been here. There's a CD that's downloadable with 28 tracks of music. Both books have CDs that are with them, downloadable. And so I think there's over 50 contributors easily to the book in addition to my photographs.
Could you say something about I think one of the things that fascinates me is I call it the ledger art that you include?
Yeah, it is called ledger art. So in both books, there's an inclusion of ledger art. There's a good bit more of it in the newer book about the water protectors. But ledger art is, talk about giving Lakota people a voice in the books. It's a traditional way that they would make art and tell stories. So the Lakota and Sioux culture is, Sioux's a non-native word, but Lakota is one band of a larger group that gets called the Sioux. But they're verbal oral tradition. And so they didn't have a written language traditionally. And but they would have people who would keep count of the records, historical records, by painting and drawing narrative stories. And they would often do it on hides, like buffalo hides, deer hides, elk hides. And one of the things they were called was winter count, and they would tell the story of how the year was. They would talk about how it was for hunting, for whether there were wars, whether there was good food or an abundance, or just keep track of things. And so there was artists who that was one of the things they did, and then people just made images. But when they went and agreed to end the Indian Wars, quote unquote, and stop fighting with the U.S. government, one of the things they did was they agreed to stay on reservation land, to live on it. And not always only, but they would live on reservation lands collectively, and the government would give them things in exchange for giving up their way of life. So the Plains Indians, the Lakota people, Nakota and Dakota, all these groups were they were travelers. They didn't have a home base all the time. They lived in one place in the summer. They lived in another place in the winter where there was more firewood. And they would follow the buffalo herds for food and everything else they needed. But when they lived on the reservations, they were giving up a lot of that. So the government gave them supplies. And one of the supplies they would give in the contract is, or the peace treaty is, they would give them food. And so there would be allotments of food that they would get. And there would be non-native people who would have like a store that would give out the food, and they would keep, in an old-fashioned ledger book, they would keep track of who they gave their monthly allotment to, their meat, their flour, their sugar, and all the things that go along with it that got people into have a lot of diabetes because a lot of it wasn't what they were supposed to eat, wasn't natural to them. But when they would keep track of it in the ledger books, they would, once the book got full, they would just toss it aside, or they would give it to the artists who were around on the treaties, around the trading post. And these artists would start painting pictures on it. So they had these books that were often, well, they're different sizes, but probably the most common was about, like a 11 by 13 inch book that opened it up and it's twice as big, and they would have pages, and they would paint scenes. And the indigenous people, like a lot of communities in the world, have great sense of humor. They have a lot of hardship, and one of the ways they deal with hardship is through a lot of sense of humor. So the ledger art came out of this, taking the old tradition of telling stories, and now they can't paint on the hides, but they can paint on the ledger books, and they would start painting. So now there's a whole movement of people who do this in a more contemporary way, where they look at their contemporary culture and the realities that they live within, and they make images. There are those who do it just to make money, and they make kind of pretty scenes that often non-natives would buy, teepees and buffalo on the horizon and things like that, landscapes. But there's a lot of people who do it culturally, where they're poking fun at their own culture, they're poking fun at the non-native community, the racism, the power struggles, environmental struggles, and things like that. And so we, in the book, I think there's these 4 or 5 different people who contributed.
Why don't you show us?
So one artist is Dwayne Wilcox, who was in the first book too. And Dwayne is probably well, I don't know if I really know this, but I was going to say he's probably the most well-known of them, but I actually don't really know that. But he is gotten very well-known, and he's successful. And I think he just has a great sense of humor. But I'm going to have to be careful, because this is the only copy of the book that's out, and it's in the U.S., but it's not bound yet. But this one... This was after, in October, when the oil company's security guards and some of the police had used dogs and clubs and pepper spray on water protectors who were demonstrating against the burying of the pipeline. And what they would do, the water protectors would go to where the pipeline was, and as an action, they would go there to a site where it was being buried, and they would just sing and pray and drum for the day. But the oil workers, pipeline workers, would get afraid and would go home. So every day they did this, they stopped the progress for a day. Yes. While they didn't think they were really going to stop it, but while they were slowing it down, the lawyers were working in Washington, D.C. and in Bismarck to try and change the policies. So this one's called, it's after that happened, and Dwayne Wilcox put together this one, and it's on they use ledger books that are from all over. This one's a judgment document circuit court book. And it's a picture of two police or security guards, not sure which, with their flags and their badges and their bulletproof vests and their big clubs, and dogs that are chained up, and there's the no dapple sign with bullet holes in the background. And it's titled, "After a Long Day of Clubbing, Dog Tired, and It's Miller Time." And yeah, so he's having a beer. That's kind of Dwayne's sense of humor, which I really like.
It's important to have one when you're in a crisis like that.
He has such a good sense of humor, and he's really prolific. He doesn't only make ledger art, but ledger art is the thing he's most well known for. He does a lot of really good painting and sculpture. You can look up his website. It's Dog Hat Studio, and it's just amazing how much of this work he has. Here's one in the book with two people in headdresses like chiefs, and they have a digital camera, and they're photographing a large melting ice block. And this is in the back of the book, and it's titled "Fake News Report. They say if you take a picture, it lasts longer." So that's his. And then somebody else, Joe Pulliam, is somebody who's been getting more and more recognition and doing really good work in his community. Here's a couple of his.
Yes.
This one's called Rubber Bullet Martyr, and it's a woman who's handcuffed to a cross. She's got arrows in her hands as she's attached to the cross. She's wearing a gas mask, and there's the river flowing below her. And he's poking fun at religion, and not because he's not religious. He's very spiritual, and he appreciates religion, but he's poking fun at the way that religion gets used as an excuse to do harm to others. And this one is on a banknote from 1915 instead of a piece of ledger paper. It's become more popular to use other things. So they use banknotes, stock notes, things like that, as well as ledger paper. But this one is somebody who's in prayer, who's got the headdress on again, which to have a headdress like that, you would have to earn each of those feathers. It doesn't come lately. It's got 7 teepees in the background for the 7 bands of the Sioux people. He's got all the traditional regalia of the beadwork and the pipe bag and all that. And he's holding the chanupa. The chanupa is a pipe that's the sacred covenant with the Great Spirit. That when you carry a chanupa, for all the generations they've been using these, all the stone comes out of the same mine, and the belief is that you live in a certain way with a covenant with the Great Spirit, and if you live that way, everything you do positively contributes to the strength of the sacred circle of all forms of life and all people, past, present, and future. And everything that you do that's negative hurts that and weakens the sacred circle. So it's really important. So he's standing there in prayer with his chanupa, and it's just titled "Warrior Standing in Prayer," but he's also wearing a gas mask. So those are a few of the examples. These are by an elder. This is "The Protector of the Black Snake" by Jerry Yellowhawk. And this one is a combination of his drawings, his paintings, and photographs. So it's got the police in riot gear and the razor wire. It's got the black snake. They have a prophecy of the oil pipeline that they view as the oil pipeline is this prophecy that they have going way back about a black snake that would hurt the environment. There's a filmmaker here. There's the police cars that they would use, militarized cars. And this is called "We Die for Our Rights," and that's also by Jerry Yellowhawk. This one was by Gilbert Kills Plenty III. He's from the Standing Rock Reservation, and this one was done in the camps. And I forget how many it is, but it's something to the, it's 16 pages of ledger paper that he brought in the camps. All these were drawings that were made during the camp. So it's kind of like a winter count of the camp. All these different people's stories and contributions. And then I think there's an oil painting in here too.
What kind of material did they use? They used paint?
They often use watercolor, but Gilbert kills Pretty Enemy the Third. He's using markers. This is oil paints, but it also has barbed wire in it.
Yeah.
This is by it's Jim Yellowhawk, the son of Jerry, and it's Minnie Wiconi. Water is life. Water is medicine, and it's a large painting. I was trying to find one more, but there's one in here that's. Oh, here it is. This is this is also by Gilbert Kills Pretty Enemy the Third, and it's markers mostly, and ink pen and some watercolor on ledger paper, and it is a picture that's modeled after a famous painting of George Armstrong Custer in his last stand, circled by his soldiers as they're being attacked and surrounded by the Plains Indians who were killing them for invading and killing native people into the native lands. And so this one's called Morton County Sheriff's Last Stand. So this is the Morton County Sheriff who led the police force and the oil company security against the water protectors. And then there's a few other kinds of things. There's a sculptor who was there, who was working with found objects, and he was there at the end of the camp, and he put together an exhibit of a lot of artifacts that were left behind in the camp. His name is Michael Stevenson, and
So what are those?
they're or things that he found in the camp. So this is an upside down flag that says this side up, and there were flags everywhere in the camps. Indigenous people are very patriotic, and it's a really interesting thing to go to the reservation, spend a lot of time with indigenous communities, and they have flags all over. They have more people who join the U.S. military forces than any group per capita are indigenous people. And when they are also, and the Lakota people, Pine Ridge Reservation is the poorest place in America, in the United States, and has been for most of the last 75 years. And when it wasn't, it's because of other Lakota reservations like Standing Rock for short periods of time were considered poorer. So why are these places as patriotic as they are? Why do they have the flags all the time? And why do they send their people to wars, foreign wars, and fight all the time? Why? And if you talk to them about it, they'll say that they're not fighting in the wars for the U.S. government. They hate the government. They think the government does a lot of negative things to people, not just their people, but people who don't have much, poor people, minorities and so forth. But they do believe that America is one of the greatest places on earth, and that it's really important for people to care about where they come from, and it's the land they're fighting for, and it's the people. So they support the people who live in America. They support the land. They want to take care of it. So the flag upside down is a military distress call. It means it's a distress call. So when it's a flag in a situation like this, it means a nation in distress. So that was a flag he found at the end of the camp. Michael Stevenson did. And then this is a drumstick, and it says, "Please handle with care." And because the movement was a prayer camp, one of the things that happened all the time was there would be singing and drumming and prayer songs. And one of the main ways that indigenous people drum is they have a big drum, and they sit around in a circle, and they sing and they drum together in traditional songs. And to non-natives, it often sounds like just this rhythmic music that they either like or don't like, but they don't understand that it's prayer. And it has meaning. Every one of those songs has meaning, and it's all about taking care of the world. And I'll just point out too that one thing is, when I was in the camps, every once in a while I would go to town to get supplies. I would go to do laundry or something like that, and I would go out of my way to go and do something like go sit in a diner or a laundromat or somewhere where I could meet locals from Bismarck and Mandan, North Dakota, people who are not indigenous and not in the community, not in the camps, and just talk to them about what was their perceptions. And it was always interesting how many people I would meet who had incredible misconceptions. One of them was that they had heard that people in the camps were getting paid $25 to $35 an hour to be there in protests, which was really, interesting. And when I would ask, well, who in the world would be paying for that? That's a lot of money when you have thousands of people and they're there for some people were there for many months and just gave up their homes and their jobs and everything to be there. And the only person who ever came up with an answer I could understand as even possible was somebody who said they thought maybe the railroad company, because if the pipeline got put in successfully, then the railroad would no longer be carrying all that oil on the trains. That was one thought.
Wow.
But another common thing that I would hear out and around in Bismarck and Mandan off the camps and back in the East and in the media was that these people were hypocrites because they all took, they used oil to get there. They drove cars, they got planes, oil, we use oil all the time, and yet they're sitting there protesting and trying to stop this oil pipeline from being put in. So that people were calling them hypocrites. And I just like to point out that I never met any indigenous people there who thought that that nobody should use oil, nobody can use oil. What they wanted to do is they wanted to think about how do we pay attention to the earth, the environment, and what we do for not only this generation, but all the future generations to protect. They feel like it's our job to protect the world for others in the future is even more important than our job to live well now. So they really do that. And when people would say, oh, they're just saying that because it's easy to say, one story that to me is a really good example of how that's not true. So they really do want to build, they want to just see that people put energy into making a infrastructure and future plans that will do things in a better way than we do things now. That doesn't mean they're saying that anybody who uses oil is bad, but they think that rather than putting in a pipeline or many pipelines that will be around for 40, 50 years as infrastructure to keep using oil, that we could be working on making alternative infrastructure that is less dangerous, more positive environmentally. That's one thing. But back to the hypocritical thing is, when they were given the reservations, they were promised the Black Hills would be theirs forever and ever as long as the sun shone. It's in the treaty, I think, of 1858 or 1878, one of those two treaties. And as long as they didn't fight the government, they would have that as part of their land. And that is the most sacred land there is because they believe that their emergence stories are they came out of there. And so it's really, really important to them. Once gold was found and other minerals in the Black Hills, miners and non-native people would just start going there and mining. And then if they got into fights with native people because they were doing things on native land, they would go to the U.S. government and insist that the U.S. military come and defend them and take care of them. And the U.S. government did, said they had to because they were their tax-paying citizens. So that they fought to protect them. And the way that the government would resolve this is they would just change the boundaries of the reservations. Mm-hmm. And you can see maps, historical maps that show reservations getting smaller and smaller and smaller every time non-native people realized there was something on reservation land they wanted. And so they stole the Black Hills from the native people. But the native people, instead of starting the wars up again, what they did was they took them to court. They decided to fight it, and the the way that the U.S. government says they should fight it. And they took this to court, and they fought it in the court system all the way up until 1970. In 1970, they won in the U.S. Supreme Court. The Supreme Court acknowledged that, yes, the Black Hills and the Dakotas belong to the indigenous people, to the Plains Indians, the Lakota and Nakota and others, and that they were wrongfully stolen. So the people were like, okay, so give us our land back. And they said, we can't. It's been in non-native lands for so long, and there's so many businesses and people and families who have invested money in it, so we don't feel like now we can give it back to you, even though we acknowledge it was wrongfully stolen from you. So what we're going to do is we're going to pay you for it. And the indigenous people were like, we don't want your money. That's our sacred land. That's the most spiritual place on earth. We want that back. And they said, well, we can't give it back. So the U.S. Supreme Court put $350 million in 1970 into an escrow account for these tribes. And the indigenous people, again, like I said, the Lakota people live on the poorest place on this planet, not this planet, in this country, Pine Ridge Reservation. It's the poorest county. They have never spent $1 since 1970. So that's almost 50 years. They have been living so poor that many people do not have running water. Many people do not have good heat. Many people do not have homes. There are as many as 25, 30 people sometimes living in a home that's built for 5. And sometimes people freeze to death. Sometimes people starve to death. Their unemployment rate, that we get upset when our unemployment rate goes up to 10%, the whole country is freaking out. Their unemployment rate is normally 75 to 85% on the reservation. Wow. These are just some of the statistics of how extremely poor they can be. But at the same time, because of their belief system and taking care of the future and their pride, that land is so important. They've never spent $1 of that $350 million that was in escrow, that all they have to do is go to the bank and draw it out. And it's now worth over $1 billion because of compounded interest, and they still won't spend it. So when people talk about they're hypocritical because they drove a car to get there, I think people are going all the way back to the beginning of this conversation. People are only looking through the blinders of the way that we live and the way that we see, and not understanding that they really, really do hold dear their belief system, their philosophy, their spirituality, their appreciation of the earth, their virtues. Like when I'm just so used to being in communities where when people are looked at and having a really nice car or really lots of nice clothes or big house or take vacations and all this, that people around them look at them as being successful. Lakota friends I know, if they saw all that and saw poorer families around them, they would not look at them as successful, because one of their most important virtues in their philosophy is generosity. So they would look at these people, and while maybe my neighbors would be saying that those are a really successful family, my Lakota friends would be sitting there and thinking, why are they so selfish? Why aren't they sharing? You know, so they're really, it's complex, but there's real beauty in things about their way of life. And with all honesty, they don't do everything perfectly, but they have a lot that the rest of us could learn from.
Thank you.
Babble away.